Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, we're talking about V-Wars, Season 1, Episode 8, entitled Red Rain. Is the episode title a reference to the Peter Gabriel song from the 1980s? Who knows? Not me. If you're interested in this video and have your own interpretation, there is a very 80s song available for you on YouTube. It is called Red Rain by Peter Gabriel. Maybe you'll just enjoy the vibe of it. Maybe you'll find some meaning with the show. Who's to say? This one was a little bit harder to pin down than the other episodes that were pretty clearly named after some different poems throughout history. So I'm not sure where to place this one. So instead, today, we're going to talk about the events of Episode 8, where we're going morally/philosophically, how the characters are growing, and then we're also going to talk about the concept of actual red rain in nature, which is also often referred to as blood rain. We're going to see how that presents in different countries and what it is actually caused by. So buckle up, we are going to explore the mystery of red rain later on in the segment. But first, let's go ahead and pick up where we left off at the end of Episode 7. So, we know from the end of Episode 7 that Des is in that vampire internment camp. Rather, it's not specifically for vampires, or as they're referring to themselves as being Bloods and Vertilacs, but rather it is for people who are even suspected of having come in contact with someone who may have been exposed to the virus. This is contact tracing taken to a dark extreme, where these people are being rounded up and placed in these camps by government officials. If you guys have been following along with the news, then you'll know that the real life component of the DNS is the DHS, our Department of Homeland Security, instead of the Department of National Security, as we have in the show. As we've discussed in the past, the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID-19 are very strongly able to be viewed allegorically through the lens of V-Wars. And with these current events, it seems to be more and more like we are getting into a V-Wars type world, which is definitely not the future that Star Trek promised me, or the one that I was remotely even hoping for. Yet here we are. So recently in the news in the US, the Department of Homeland Security has been seen in masked, camouflaged outfits without identification badges, arresting protesters in Portland, Oregon. Now, this isn't just something that someone took from a side website on the internet and decided to blow up. A U.S. attorney for the Oregon District requested an investigation into it on this past Friday. If you are listening to this in the future, today is Monday. So this was 3 days ago that the Oregon U.S. Attorney has gone ahead and requested an investigation into this. The request has specifically been directed at the Department of Homeland Security, our DNS equivalent, and the specific personnel who were on video arresting protesters and funneling them into unmarked SUVs. That is almost exactly what happens to Dez. Although he is not even a protester, he'd just been attacked by a blood. But it very much is this concept of guilty by association or infected by association. And that's what's happening with Dez and with these protesters. Dez isn't necessarily a threat any more than a lot of these peaceful protesters are. However, because they are part of a protest, and because Dez had been exposed to or around this vampire, they are rounded up by DNS or DHS personnel who are not marked or identified in any way and are then placed into unlabeled or unmarked vehicles and taken elsewhere. V-Wars truly seems to be becoming more and more poignant as we move forward in 2020. It's really honestly a shame that this show has not been picked up for a second season, as there are so many parallels. And as we get further into this episode, we start to see even more of those with the political process as well as the DNS process. It's honestly super relevant in such a holistic way that it's striking that it didn't get picked up again. So I know that a lot of people have expressed different opinions from mine regarding the pacing of the show, but I'm so here for it. Remember, the first season is kind of like, in my opinion anyway, the first chapter of a book. I will always read the first 2 to 3 chapters to get the basics of what's going on with this world under my belt, and then decide if I want to stay there. Beginnings of anything tend to be more difficult than a lot of the other parts of life or creativity. And so for me, getting that first season out of the way is really important for a show to just find its footing, if that makes sense. I think of it as being similar to Star Trek Enterprise. The first season, I was not really a fan of. And for Star Trek Enterprise, it took it about 3.5 seasons to really get its feet under it. But season 4 was so good once they had finally established a clear villain. And in the case of V-Wars, we already have a clear villain. I think that we're on very solid footing to continue with a second season, however that may look. But unfortunately, that is not up to me. Y'all know how much I love my science-heavy sci-fi. So this is truly right up my alley, and I'm not going to give up on it being picked up by someone else later on, or us seeing it continued in a different medium. This is the age of shows getting kicked off of Netflix and picked up by Amazon Prime, or shows getting kicked off of network television and picked up by a different network, or getting picked up by Netflix then. One of my favorite comparisons to this is also JAG. So, it's not sci-fi, but I've spoken about this in the past. I did not enjoy the first season of JAG all that much. I didn't really connect with the female lead in a way that I need to connect with the characters, who are the main characters at least, in order to continue with the story. But NBC dropped that show after the first season in 1995, 1996. And then after that, CBS picked it up, recast the female lead. So they went through and they were like, what worked for this before? What didn't work? Let's address those things, keep the things that work, go through and scientific method this show. And then they picked Catherine Bell as the new female lead. And that show ran for another 9 seasons, y'all. Also, let's be honest. The first season of Stargate SG-1 had a few kinks in it. You guys know the episode I'm talking about primarily. Emancipation. The one in which Sam has to hand fight this man in combat to save all of these women from the patriarchy. But it's very much Team America World Police and kind of white savior complex in that manner. And that's something that I enjoy them calling themselves out on in the episode 200, where they're talking about them being Team America World Police by how they are being the Team America World Police puppets, and they're taking this manifest destiny type approach. Also, that same person who wrote the episode of Emancipation in Stargate, episode 3, also wrote the worst episode of Star Trek Enterprise. Enterprise is beloved by tons of geeks everywhere. However, there were some problems in season 1. Personally, I was never a big fan of Tasha Yar, at all. No offense to the actress who played her. That's not necessarily on her. But the same lady who wrote the worst episode of Stargate also wrote the worst episode of Star Trek Enterprise. In fact, it has also been referred to as being quite possibly the worst piece of Star Trek ever made. And that is a direct quote. So it has the exact same premise, except it changes the group of people. So instead of Sam, Tasha Yar is abducted by the leader of this different group, and they are going to use her for their own means in increasing their power or status, etc. This episode was written by Catherine Powers and someone named Michael Barron. So they were able to use this episode in both Star Trek and Stargate. So in SG-1, it is the 3rd episode of season 1, and in Star Trek The Next Generation, it is the 4th episode of season 1, and in that case, it is called Code of Honor instead of Emancipation. Technically, Emancipation is often referred to as being episode 4, but Children of the Gods episode 1 and 2, so it's a 2-part episode that was split into 2, but it's still called Children of the Gods Part 1 and Children of the Gods Part 2, so I refer to Emancipation as being episode 3. But it just depends on whom specifically in the fandom you are speaking with when you are discussing the show. But roughly, they're just about the same episode, both in narrative and in placement. And they are both widely considered to be the worst episodes of their series, if not their franchises. My overall point is, if you are with me in having seen these episodes and recognize how problematic they are and how just narratively not great they are. The problematic portions, I mean that in the socio-cultural manner, they can be considered by many to be downright offensive. They were not really properly handled, especially considering the fact that Daniel's an anthropologist. I expected a lot more from that. But again, both these episodes were written by the same person. This is a very typical 90s episode. And this person managed to wedge this same storyline into two of the largest sci-fi franchises of all time in their season ones. So we don't have this problem again after this season one of each of these shows. Don't get me wrong. Stargate and Star Trek still had their own problematic aspects throughout the years, and Stargate has been overall, I think, very good at calling themselves out about it in a very meta way throughout the years. But that doesn't change the fact that these are kind of time capsules of these problematic portrayals, and they show us how far we've come and still how far we have yet to go. But even if we boil this down to just the narrative component, we can also see that even shows that started out with terrible plots in some of the episodes in their first season, or dialogue that was problematic, like how Sam was portrayed in the first season of Stargate SG-1, or how most episodes of Stargate and also definitely of Star Trek don't pass the Bechdel test, but they tend to get better as the series progress. And narratively, they really get their feet under them as they look back and go, oh, hey, that was really embarrassing and that was problematic and we totally misjudged that and we mishandled that. That's not the direction we want to take. Let's course correct. And V-Wars is not nearly as bothersome to me in their season one narratives as some of my other favorite sci-fis like Stargate and Star Trek are. You guys know how much I love both of those shows. I talk about them constantly in real life as well as in these podcasts. But my point is that I've heard a lot of criticism about V-Wars narratively, and I really don't think it's that much of a problem. I think that a lot of the socio-cultural considerations and the scientific and political considerations and this direction of viewing vampires as being an epigenetic trait for vampirism rather than just having a fantastical origin is really fresh, and I very much enjoy it. It's what I want in my sci-fi, and I might be in the minority for that, but if you're solely judging it on its narrative components or these other types of issues that may have been shared with Stargate or Star Trek Season 1 or anything throughout the rest of the shows, I think that V-Wars definitely has its own strengths, and much like those shows were able to course correct and become hallmarks of our favorite genre, that V-Wars should really be allowed to do the same. If you haven't seen V-Wars yet, and you are just counting down the days until I finish talking about V-Wars, you're really missing out, and I hope that you go and check out this show. Go ahead and watch all of the first season. There aren't that many episodes, and I think that you really might fall in love with it. I never listen to Rotten Tomatoes or anything like that. I almost always disagree with them. But, I mean, don't listen to just my review or these other reviews on the internet. Go out and watch it for yourself, especially if you like science-heavy sci-fi, because I think that you may really enjoy it. Alright, we're gonna go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about what happens in this internment camp. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, I was passionately discussing some similarities with other sci-fi shows that people thought had a rough first season, but went on to become hallmarks of their franchise. And I know that this might be a bold statement, but I think that V-Wars has that capability as well. Even if it doesn't turn into a franchise per se, I think that it could be a very strong series within this genre if more people gave it a chance, and if it had the fandom behind it like shows like The Expanse did. I also was discussing how there are increasing parallels between V-Wars and real life as 2020 progresses. So in V-Wars Episode 8, Red Rain, the one we're discussing today, there are people being pulled into internment camps just due to association or being in a specific place at a specific time by the Department of National Security. Just as there are people being picked up for the same reason right now by unmarked agents from the Department of Homeland Security in Portland, Oregon. So we were discussing the convergence of art and real life and how they imitate one another. And now we're going to talk about what happens when Luther goes in to try to rescue Des, and what happens with Kaylee as well. So first up, we know that Des is in this internment camp. We know that he actually has been sick. He may or may not be turning into a blood. He may or may not be one by now. Luther, however, is hell-bent on saving him. He is going to rescue him no matter what Jimmy wants, to the point that Luther held a gun to his own head and threatened to kill himself if Jimmy did not take him to save Des first. Luther is not about to live a life without his son, and he's not going to save his own life at the risk of his son's life. So Luther goes in with Jimmy, and they shake things up a bit. Granted, Jimmy stays on the outside of the camp, but that is, eventually, we see, better for all involved. As Luther goes and breaks into the camp, he does find Des right before Des is almost attacked by a giant man who has recently turned into a blood. It appears that once someone turns, the DNS agents are locking them in a separate caged area within the overall caged area, but it looks like they missed this guy. So he goes to attack Des after asking them to take him with them because he hears likely that they're escaping, because remember, they have super hearing. And so he tries, Luther that is, to convince this guy that they're not escaping, but then we see that he's actually a blood, and he goes to attack them. At which point, bless his heart, Luther loves his son above all else and pushes Des behind him and tries to fight this blood, but even in a match with this guy before he was turned into a blood via exposure to the prions and the epigenetic changes, I really doubt that Luther could have taken him. So Luther tries anyway, though, bless his heart, and I love to see it. It is so wholesome, and I love how much he loves his son, even while he is getting his butt kicked super hard like he is Captain Kirk or Agent Mulder. Now, on the bright side, the DNS agents do break up this fight, which would have really quickly led to Luther's death and exsanguination. But on the other hand, it's not super great because now the DNS agents see Luther and recognize him. So one of them had actually worked with Luther before at the DNS facility and definitely recognized him. And Luther gets really upset with him and is like, "Hey man, you tried to kill me." And the guy shrugs it off, saying, "Hey, that wasn't my call." So he's using that excuse of, "I was just following orders." I find this to be very interesting and deliberate on the part of the writers, because this phrase is also known as the Nuremberg defense. It is known in multiple languages in very similar phrasing. Like in German, it is translated to "an order is an order." And it is a plea that's used in a court of law that is saying, I should not be held guilty for my actions because someone in higher authority than me ordered it to be done. Whether that is an official who told a firefighter or a civilian to do something, or a superior officer in the military, or a superior official in law enforcement. It's also referred to as the Nuremberg defense because it was a plea used during the Nuremberg trials by folks who were accused in 1945 to 1946. And if you're not familiar with the Nuremberg trials, those were a series of military tribunals that were held by the primary allies after World War II. And it was during these trials that the prosecution of very prominent members of the Nazi Party were tried. These trials were also held under the London Charter of the International Military Tribunal, and it established that that defense of saying, hey, I was just following orders, or superior orders, or an order is an order, is not enough to escape punishment. It is perhaps enough to lessen punishment in a court of law, but it is not enough to completely abdicate responsibility for your actions. There is still a component of choice or free will that's involved in those situations. Now, the Nuremberg trials are the most notable use of this defense because it was such a departure from all of the other types of warfare that have been waged in the past. That's not to say that people weren't incredibly violent or homicidal in the past, but rather that humanity had taken fighting and aggression to new levels at that time. And these atrocities were so great and so difficult for humans to wrap their minds around that we really had to take a new approach with this in saying, hey, yes, I was told to go ahead and straight up murder all of these people based on their ethnicities and their beliefs and their sexuality and so on. But, I was just following orders. We're saying at that time, that's enough. There is no way that you can go through and be the person Who is responsible for killing all of these people, for putting them into the gas chambers and such, and just walk away from this totally scot-free? It's unconscionable to do so. This isn't something that you can walk away with a clear conscience from. And because the Allies are who won World War II, the Axis was primarily who was charged with these types of mass atrocities. Although the Allies also committed mass bombings, like the bombing of Dresden. If you aren't familiar with that one, that was a carpet bombing by British and American allies in a region of Germany called the state of Saxony. And Dresden was the capital city of Saxony during World War II. This happened from February 13th through the 15th in 1945, and it's considered to be controversial partly because Dresden was not a really important location for production for the Nazi Germans. So it wasn't important for producing anything that was related to wartime. It wasn't a major industrial center. And before that air raid in February of 1945, it hadn't even suffered a major Allied attack. There didn't seem to be a very solid military reason for bombing Dresden. To many, it was primarily considered to be a soft target, a non-military target. It was considered to be primarily a bombing of civilians, and it nearly razed the entire city to the ground. It also became a symbol of what was referred to during the war as terror bombing, because it was meant to promote terror rather than to accomplish any other military strike-related goals. It was mostly undefended. Dresden didn't have any anti-aircraft guns. It was a really old city, and a report that was made on it in October 1944 said that it wasn't really good as a potential bombing target, and stated that compared to towns of its size, Dresden's an unattractive blitz target. But 4 months later, in February of 1945, it became the target. It's thought that this is largely due to German troops moving through Dresden in the early part of 1945. They think that that was to fight the Soviet army, who were advancing at the time, or perhaps to reinforce their forces somewhere else. It turned out to be a key transport junction at the time, and so Churchill and his war cabinet made Dresden their primary strategic target. They felt that bombing that city might slow the flow of Germans and also speed up the Soviet army getting there to fight Germany. So they thought that bombing Dresden might help the Russian war effort too. If you look at the National Archives, they also suggest that there might have been another reason for choosing Dresden. They think that the bombing was going to help impact morale. They wanted the civilians to perhaps be so traumatized by this carpet bombing, by being constantly under these physical threats to their lives, that they would stop believing that they could win the war and therefore stop supporting the war effort. We had seen this happen on both sides in this war already, in attacks in London in 1940 to 41, Coventry in 41, as well as in Hamburg that same year. But that actually made people more determined, not less determined, and that was 3 to 4 years before. So perhaps they thought that it being later on in the war effort, it would make more of a difference, but it seems that empirically this had shown to, in fact, have the opposite effect before. This was also right after Britain had gone through the Blitz and had been randomly bombarded by German rockets, and Hitler had gone through Warsaw. So the British leaders knew about the Nazi treatment of the Jewish people in the concentration camps and went through and made this decision at that time. But the fact is, they were also largely still bombing civilians. And if that secondary reason is true, that they were trying to traumatize the residents, which is very much a war tactic, then that really is an act that's meant to promote terror. It's estimated that 300,000 refugees were in that city, and Churchill has been quoted as saying, "It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing of German cities, simply for the sake of increasing terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed." He is also specifically stated in memos that have been recorded in history, because we do keep those types of things in the U.S., that, quote, "We should use available effort in one big attack on Berlin and attacks on Dresden, Leipzig, and Chemnitz, or any other cities where a severe blitz will not only cause confusion in the evacuation from the east, but will also hamper the movement of troops from the west." And specifically, in another memo, he advocated bombing Dresden and said, quote, "It will cause great confusion in civilian evacuation from the east and hamper movement of reinforcements from other fronts." End quote. Now, if you would like to read more about Judgment at the Smithsonian, I think that it would be very illuminating for your read-throughs of sci-fi books like Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, in which he excoriates them for the bombing of Dresden, in feeling that it was unnecessary to do so, according to him. And I think it also has a lot of relevance for V-Wars, and perhaps many other movies out there like District 9 that really explore the different moral and ethical considerations of war. But this book is called Judgment at the Smithsonian, The Bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's edited by Philip Nobile, and you can find it on Amazon.com. It is a subject of banned history, and it's the uncensored script of the proposed 50th anniversary exhibit at the Smithsonian of the Enola Gay. And it was prevented by Newt Gingrich and a lot of other politicians and several different interest groups like the government, the military, and even the media, all banded together to get this historical and sociological and anthropological exhibit totally rewritten to reflect a morality that might not actually be there, depending on who you discuss it with. Because remember that history is always written by the victors, but atrocities can still be committed on both sides. And I tell you all of this about World War II and so on because it is increasingly relevant as we make it through these last few episodes of V-Wars. There are things that the humans do and the things that the Bloods do. And from our perspective, looking at it as humans versus Bloods, I think it's really a lot easier to take that bit of distance and go, hey, neither of these approaches were necessarily the best approach, or neither of these was necessarily entirely ethical. Now, granted, I've had this argument with many different people over the years, really good friends of mine included, who have vehemently taken different viewpoints than I have. Some people argue that war is never moral or never ethical, and so therefore all bets are off, that there's nothing off the table. but international criminal law says otherwise. So it really depends on your understanding of criminal law and ethics and philosophy, as well as your personal values. Regardless of where you fall on these lines related to World War II, I think that V-Wars has a lot of parallels with these philosophical components that are related to World War II, and I highly recommend this book, Judgment at the Smithsonian, to give you more perspectives in approaching understanding history, and also to understanding and enjoying sci-fi. I think that these parallels are very interesting and compelling, and it's what gets me to watch sci-fi. And after all, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. And that is also one of the elements that we are seeing in V-Wars. We're going to go on another break. And when we come back, we are going to talk about what Kaylee is up to and how Jimmy ultimately gets Luther and Des out of this sticky situation with DNS agents who are already trying to claim the Nuremberg defense. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the Nuremberg defense of saying, hey, I haven't done anything wrong because I was just following orders, and what ethics and morality really looks like inside of a war, whether you are taking the approach of the victors, which history does, or whether you are considering a different perspective, that perhaps both sides can commit atrocities, even if one side is fighting for the right things. Is doing the wrong thing for the right reasons still the wrong thing, or is it the right thing? Does the reasoning ultimately matter? Does Churchill's reasoning for carpet bombing Dresden, is that our dividing line for whether this was something that was necessary and helped us ultimately bring an end to the war quicker and prevented more loss of life? Or was this something that was just as horrible because it was meant to traumatize and promote terror and had already been shown to be ineffective from 1940 to 1941. It all depends on where you specifically fall in your understanding and familiarity with history, as well as your personal values and relationship with philosophy, ethics, and morality. But it is very interesting to see how that parallels with V-Wars, especially as we see folks already establishing the Nuremberg defense before even being put on trial It's just casually dropped by this DNS agent as a defense for having been assigned to previously kill Luther, even though there was no great reason to do so, as far as we can tell from watching. We've already spoken in previous episodes about the United States' history with internment camps on their soil, but just like this is going on in Portland with people being snatched up by unmarked, unidentified government agents and being put into vans, we also currently still do have people, children, who are being rounded up and put in internment camps, in fences and cages throughout the United States. So this is very relevant, and I think that V-Wars also serves as a very pertinent reminder that these things that seem so horrifying in the show, that are just flat out blatantly horrifying, having predators in the same cages as these vulnerable people, it's a lot clearer and easier to palate for many people than it is to go, hey, there were 4,556 allegations in 4 years alone regarding these children placed into cages, the immigrant children who were placed into these detention centers. Some of the sexual abuse is said to have come from guards. Some is reported to have come from other staff members or even other minors that are in these cages with them. Regardless, there is the presence of predators amongst a vulnerable population, just like there is in V-Wars. But when you put it in terms of vampires versus humans, it's easier for many people to understand the black and white nature of this, and it's easier for people to palate and just accept as, oh, this is bad. But when it comes to children being placed in cages on American soil and reporting sexual abuse, and many even going missing, these children are just somehow lost, or rather disappeared, as we would refer to them in anthropological context related to people who were killed or disappeared in general in Guatemala between 1960 and 1996. Over 200,000 people disappeared, and many of them we still don't know where they are. They're suspected, of course, to be dead at this point. And in 2012, there was a complaint filed with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the government was ordered to provide reparations and produce a film about the missing people. But the state refused to cooperate in that regard. Now, I know about this because I majored in forensic anthropology, and one of my best friends did a special research project on this. But many folks, I find as an adult, have not heard about this, especially adults my age, because by the end of this dictatorship in Guatemala, it was 1996, and that was the end of those disappearances, and at that time, we were about 7 years old. So for many folks around my age, millennials, they aren't familiar with this having happened at all. But according to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, this is very much a human rights violation. But it's happening right now with children in the U.S. I'm not saying that they're necessarily dead, but they are disappeared. We don't know where they are. So, again, history is written by the victors. It's really written by those in power, is what we mean by that. And we're living history all the time. Today's events are, next decade's history, even tomorrow's history. It's just more distance in time between us and the events that make it history instead of current events. But as they're current events, we don't tend to care as much, and we call it by another name. But we do have these vulnerable populations of immigrant children being held in cages and exposed to predators and also disappearing. And these are all human rights violations that are occurring here as we watch. But it's more clear to folks in V-Wars. And that's the importance of sci-fi, is that it helps us illustrate these concepts to people who might not otherwise agree with us or have a framework for building to that level of understanding. That's the power of the allegory. It allows us to not only put history in context, but also current events. It gives us lenses to shift our perspectives. So I wasn't intending to turn this into an episode regarding why I think that everyone should support V-Wars for a second season, but that seems to be where my heart is taking it tonight. So here we are. But this show is strongly allegorical, and we also see that in this case of the Nuremberg defense already being flagged, that Luther is probably going to be dead in this case if it's not for Jimmy. So Jimmy goes and instead of following in after Luther, calls Senator Giraud and tells her what's going on and gets an immediate order to get both Luther and Des out of that facility. And he shows up right before they are about to really handle this incredibly poorly. Things are not looking great for Luther when Jimmy rides in with that order from Senator Giraud and also having another court order or something signed, some kind of federal order, stating that he gets to take them into custody as an FBI agent. So Jimmy narrowly saves the day, and it's a very great scene that's showing us how politics is really strongly about to shape this. We've largely been military or the military aspects of the government, like the DNS and the FBI so far, but we're about to dive into politics. And it's about to play a really big role in this conflict, just like it does in real life. So Jimmy does ride in to this conversation in a really kind of weird way. The way he's sitting in the truck does not seem to be the most effective for getting out of it, considering he has such long legs. He seems to kind of be riding in the window of the truck with his legs sticking in the window, but the truck door closed. It's very strange, but Jimmy does get there and he hops out of the truck and gives them the order. So he is able to take Luther into his custody, and they're ultimately on the road towards Senator Giraud. Now, Kaylee, on the other hand, is not having as much of a great time as she thought she was going to. She is being fed on by Ava and the other chucklehead who she had stumbled across while out looking for Michael Vane. So Michael and Danny are back from their trip to go to this exclusive nightclub and infect the president's daughter because they have somehow found out that she has the vampire gene. And so if they expose her to the prions, then she's going to turn. And so they're making a targeted military strike to appeal to the emotional nature of the president and to try to turn the tide for them. But while they were gone, Ava and what's-his-name have kind of been torturing Kaylee just a little bit. So Kaylee is screaming to try to attract attention, and Michael and Danny come in there and find her with her neck bleeding a bit and pull the gag from her mouth and stuff. And she tells them what's been happening, but also that she wants to take down DNS because they killed Jurgen, and now they definitely have a mutual enemy in mind. So this is the new goal that seems to be uniting most of our groups that we consider to be heroes or even anti-heroes. We have a soft spot for Michael, at least I do, because he seems to really be trying to ethically and morally surf through this morass of new problems he's facing as a leader and as a brand new vampire. And I did mean morass. I mean, this man is essentially trying to surf through a bog. That is why it is really difficult. He's doing his best, but Michael does not seem to be entirely equipped for this. And honestly, who would be equipped to suddenly be turned into a vampire and then be told that you have to lead all of them? So I'm with Michael in a lot of these aspects. He's trying to find the ethics and the middle ground here, even as he is discovering who he is as this new species or subspecies, whatever we end up deciding that they genetically are. But it seems that Danny wants to take down whoever, because Danny's just in it for the power. But she's going to go along with most of what Michael wants to do anyway. Michael wants to take down DNS because they're awful jerks. And they're largely responsible for killing a lot of Bloods. They're rounding people up. They don't care so much about doing what's right or protecting people, or they wouldn't be rounding up vulnerable people and sticking them in the same cage with these predators. So I'm not saying that everyone in the cage is a predator, but rather potential predators. They have no regard for whether or not there are dangers in there. They're just going, hey, you're not important enough for me to care about whether or not you're in danger. So we have Michael wanting to take them down. Kaylee now wants to take them down. Luther definitely wants to take them down because they murdered Claire O'Hagan and everything. And now we're getting to meet Senator Sasha Giroux. And we are seeing she also wants to take down DNS. And she asks Luther to testify at a committee hearing to help take that organization down for going off of the path that they were assigned to, and maybe even blowing up their own facility in order to kill Claire O'Hagan and the other evidence. So Des seems fine. He seems to be cured. He's not sick anymore, but he's also not a Blood. But he's not super keen on being involved in this anymore. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up what's left of this episode and also talk about Red Rain. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how all of our heroes and anti-heroes are really converging on the common goal of wanting to take down the DNS. The Bloods want to take them down. Revoluix, the media, wants to take them down. So does the politician, Senator Sasha Giroux, and so does the scientist, Luther Swan. So Des seems to be alright now, but he isn't really showing any signs of being a vamp or of anything else for that matter. His fever's gone, and he tells his dad, hey, we need to find Mom because she took really good care of me and she killed a guy. She outright killed a guy to save me, and she was totally justified in it. But she loves me and she did a really good job, and I'm worried about her out there on her own. I got separated from her because of a vampire. So that's mostly what's happening. And there's a few scuffles on the way to get to Senator Giroux' house, including a guy getting shot in some diner on the side of the road that they stop at to get food along the way. But overall, it goes as well as one can reasonably predict for a caravan of feds in an apocalypse, I suppose, especially seeing how bad it was earlier when Luther was initially trying to track down Dez, and there are just squads of everyone in the street. There's DNS being unmarked, rounding people up. There's Bloods fighting people. There's vigilante gangs that are out there and just killing anyone they suspect to be a Blood, as well as people walking around with shotguns and such and shooting people they know are definitely Bloods and maybe also possible Bloods. It's very similar to how they kind of do things in movies related to zombies, where it's like, hey, you look like you're about to turn, or you're definitely turning or have turned. We're going to go ahead and kill you right now before this goes any further. So some folks aren't waiting for that confirmation, whether they be vigilantes or the DNS. Kaylee and the Bloods, though, once they are paired up, are a really strong team. And nothing is going to stop that first-hand information from getting out. Kaylee didn't have a lot to lose beforehand. She liked money and she liked power and status, but mostly she seems to be driven by that thirst for knowledge and truth and exposing the government, exposing other people, and letting the general population know what's going on. She thinks they have a right to know. And so that is what Kaylee has wholeheartedly dug into now that Jurgen is gone. They unfortunately gave her nothing left to lose. They were over here worrying about martyring Michael Fane or not martyring him, and instead they have weaponized the head of Revelix. So, not for their benefit, though. It's just really activated, super angry, efficient Kaylee mode. So now Kaylee is doing a Q&A session with Michael and Danny, and also running a video series. Not even really a series, but it's like a series of vignettes and stuff about Michael and Danny and their life, really trying to turn it into almost a fluff piece at certain points, promoting some form of empathy, or at least sympathy, and some type of humanity in the minds of humans as it relates to what Bloods look like. So they have them talk about their families and such, which, as you might expect, Mila does not take very well. It is Class A propaganda and media PR type work, but it also has a lot of side effects that are not necessarily what they were going for. So Mila is quite upset, and everyone else is still trying to sort out what is true versus what is fluff. There's propaganda on both sides now. Those machines are getting more well-oiled all the time. So this is really leaving us with an ending in which Luther has gone through and he has established staying at Senator Giroux' house because she has staff to make sure it's safe and everything like that. And she has a daughter that's right around Dez's age who's about to be coming home from her boarding school. At least I'm thinking it's boarding school, since they said that she was coming home from school and it's the middle of an apocalypse. So, I mean, I wouldn't be sending my child. We've closed the schools for COVID, and they should likely remain closed for quite a while. I don't think you would want to reopen them or even send children part-time for hybrid classes during a vampire outbreak. Because again, this prion disease is a pandemic, after all, even if it is impacting people at the epigenetic level. It's spreading very quickly, and it is caused by exposure to these prions in a respiratory manner or via bodily fluids in some cases. So, when we have that established and the kids are hanging out, they're hearing noises at night and something spooking them. They think there might be a creature on the grounds. And we ultimately have Luther being convinced by Sasha to go forward and testify about what's going on with DNS and how he suspects that Calyx is also really responsible for the death of Claire O'Hagan. So when Luther goes before the committee to testify, it seems to be daytime, I think, where he is, but it's like nighttime where the kids are. And that's kind of confusing because I was under the impression that this committee hearing was taking place in Washington and that they were in Pennsylvania. So it doesn't seem to be enough of a time difference to offset the day versus night thing. But perhaps I've just missed some other visual cues. Each time I watched it, though, me and the people I watched it with were both confused about the timing of what was happening and why in this house of seemingly tons of guards and protection and stuff, as Senator Giroux puts it, no one seems to be worried about these kids just like stumbling around in the dark and doing whatever, like looking for vampires at night. No one else seems to hear the noise that the kids heard either. I don't know about you, but that makes me question how good these guards ultimately are. But I also wonder what is happening with the timeline for day versus night. Again, that could just be me, and it's not enough of an issue to be a deal breaker in any way. I'll just have to watch it again and see if I pick up on what's going on, and even if it's an editing oversight, honestly, it's still a lot better than Emancipation and Code of Honor. And I do love Stargate and Star Trek. So it's already not nearly as bad as those shows were with their problems in the narrative storytellings in season 1. I'm just saying. So, we have Luther in before the Senate, and he is ready to testify, but Calyx Niklos comes in with Rachel, who looks very wild-eyed and panicked, and he sits down with her with like his arm around her to make sure that she can't escape. And Luther is struggling to figure out what he's going to say, and it's a little confusing because he doesn't seem to have a strong attachment to Rachel, and it's not like Niklos could outright kill Rachel while they're sitting there. At least, I don't think so. He would have to do it with like some kind of poison or something like that probably. But, you know, it's freaking out Luther, even though he's not close to his ex-wife anymore. And the last time he spoke with her, she didn't even tell him she had his kid with her. And also before that, she got in a fight with him and the DNS agent had to pull a gun on him. So, you know, and before that she was trash talking him. So I'm not really sure how strongly he's supposed to feel about Rachel. It feels like they're taking it in the direction that he is perhaps going to be with Rachel again romantically in the future. But I feel like we didn't really get to mourn his other wife, Jess, that well. So it kind of is ruining that a little bit for me. I'm totally fine with him moving forward, moving on. It's just, I don't know, it feels a little bit weird. It almost cheapens Luther's love to me, and it's just very confusing because he doesn't seem that upset about Jess, but he seems really upset about Rachel perhaps getting killed. So I don't know. There seems to be a lot of animosity between them. So that was a little bit confusing in tone, but, you know, it is the mother of his kid whose life is at stake right now. Rachel's life is at stake. So he's trying to decide what he's going to say or if he's going to say anything at all. And Senator Giroux starts panicking because it's just like the Senate Judiciary Committee meetings. If you watch those whenever they are on C-SPAN or CNN or whatever on the news, I watch them sometimes on the internet as well because they do record all of them, even if they're not necessarily televised. So I like to watch those and see how they're approached. It helps inform me on who I would like to vote for, and it also just really informs me about what's going on in our political processes outside of what they are targeting for us to see. So, I recommend checking it out if you're interested in that manner, but I also know from watching those that those are timed. So Senator Giroux is also panicking because Luther only has a specific amount of time, and she is also only allotted a specific amount of time on this schedule in order to get all of their points across. And the person who is running it is very clearly on DNS's side and is not wanting to give them any wiggle room. It comes across as very bipartisan in nature, just like any Senate Judiciary Committee meeting that I've seen on television or the internet has been in the past as well. So, if you are into politics, I also encourage you to check out those Senate Judiciary Committee meetings and see what parallels it has with this subcommittee meeting. I like to watch a couple different subcommittees, to be honest, but the Judiciary Committee meetings are my favorite to observe, and I also like to read the SCOTUS blogs. I like to read why specific Supreme Court justices have voted for or against something. If they've dissented and it seems like something that's outside of how they would usually cast their vote, I want to know why, and I learn a lot about their reasoning in that manner. And I learn a lot about the law and what else is going on in the world around me. So if you're interested in that aspect of V-Wars, I encourage you to check out those Senate subcommittee meetings, and if you are interested in Senate subcommittee meetings or SCOTUS blogs or negotiations or draftings of treaties, I also encourage you to watch V-Wars. It is a very interesting study in trying to make ground between two parties that are very much seemingly diametrically opposed. And whether you are vampires versus humans or Democrats versus Republicans in the House and Senate, we very much are seeing many of the same parallels between V-Wars and the American government today. I am out of time to talk about Red Rain today, but I will make some posts on social media regarding that red rain in Russia and Sri Lanka. I hope that you have time to check that out and learn more. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.